Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You just have to think of this as like that moment on Sky Sports when they say we're ready for kickoff and they go to adverts, which is really annoying. That's essentially what this is. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you most of all to our three panelists tonight, particularly Jonathan and Michael. This event came out of a Twitter exchange where one of them challenged the other to a debate and the other said yes, and so here we are. We, as an organisation, are the UK in a changing Europe. My purpose now is to say to you, follow us on Twitter, go to our website, sign up to our newsletter, please, because we have loads of events that are as interesting as this, and you'd love them all. One thing to make clear when it comes to the Q&A, the way this is going to be structured is both of our panellists are going to make short introductory remarks. They're going to have a small chat amongst the three of them, and then we're going to have audience questions. This is not a debate about Brexit.
We're all Brexiteers now.
That might not be true either, but this is a debate about experts and their role. So if you could bear that in mind when asking your questions, if you keep your questions polite, that would be much appreciated. Julia said I would be introducing our panellists. That's Julia, you've heard of her. This is Michael Gove, you know who he is, and that's Jonathan Portes. You've probably heard of him, and all you need to know is he's a senior fellow with the UK in a changing Europe. If you really want to, you can Google them all. Julia, I'll let you do all the hard work now. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, come on, give him a round of applause. Well, the last time I was here, actually, was for a planning award, so I'm hoping this is going to be a little bit livelier. I'm obviously chairing tonight's event. They needed to have someone, I think referee is perhaps a more accurate term. So think of me as the David Dimbleby of the evening, only in slightly higher heels and slightly more ruthless. Of course, this all comes about, as of course you'll know, not just from this one Twitter spat, but it all really dates back to a rather infamous quote from Michael Gove when he was doing the Sky News interview during the EU referendum campaign. I think the people in this country have had enough of experts. Of course, an awful lot of people don't know that it went on from there while he was being interrupted by Faisal Islam. He said, from organisations with acronyms saying that they know what's best and is getting it consistently wrong. Now, many of us might think that people may also have had enough of politicians and journalists as well. And in the era of fake news, post-truth and alternative facts, who are we to decide and how are we to decide who to trust? Well, we've got lies, damned lies, statistics and Donald Trump's Twitter feed to help us now. So what do we mean by experts? Well, we're in the Royal College of Surgeons, so I think we better say doctors are experts, perhaps scientists, mathematicians, but economists and pollsters and politicians, nay, even journalists? Well, pollsters have had it pretty bad since, well, for quite a couple of years now. Pretty much every major election or referendum prediction they've made has been completely wrong. Although I'd like to point out a brand new poll was published today. I don't know if you've seen it since you got here. It found that amazingly 64% of people do still trust opinion polls, as opposed to the 59% who don't. So yeah, that's good. Economists, of course, haven't had such a good run of it, have they? Failure to predict the 2007 crash, and we're still awaiting that recession and the mass job losses we were predicted to have by now after the Brexit vote. But then politicians often don't seem to know what they're doing either when it comes to facts. Philip Hammond hasn't even bothered to read the last Tory manifesto until 8 o'clock this morning. But if we aren't going to make policy based on facts, on the evidence, are we just going to trust our instincts, trust our gut? In which case, why don't we just toss a coin to decide every policy? So let's get on with the evening as planned. Without further ado, we'll hear opening statements from both of our panellists, and then, of course, we'll have I think a bit of a ding-dong between them, and we would absolutely love you to get involved. But first up, let's hear what Jonathan Portes has to say.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks very much indeed to Michael for suggesting this debate and coming. I think it's very brave of him indeed and also constructive to be prepared to engage in this public debate, because it really is an important debate, and I'm genuinely unsure about some of the questions that I'm going to try and answer in the next few minutes, or indeed in the next hour, about what the role of experts is in the public debate, because I think it is not an easy set of issues to grapple with. But what is the role of experts? And more than that, how should the media and politicians use experts and what they say? I think is a very important question for in the political situation that we find ourselves now, the political conjuncture we find ourselves now, and it's quite a difficult one to answer. And I'm assuming here that we are talking primarily about economists and other social scientists, not physicists or biotechnologists or indeed surgeons. I mean, we shouldn't assume that the hard sciences are immune either, as some of the debates around climate change or vaccines show. But I think when it comes to the political debate, mostly what we are talking about is the social scientists. So what is our function? I think we have broadly three really important functions. The first is to explain our basic concepts and most important insights in plain English. Famously, Paul Samuelson, the founder of modern macroeconomics, was once asked, by a mathematician, I should say, whether economics told us anything at all that was both true but not obvious. It actually took him a couple of years to come up with an answer, but he did eventually give a very good example, Adam Smith's theory of comparative advantage, which is true, in some sense anyway, certainly useful, and it's not at all obvious. And similarly, I often say that the most useful thing that I did in my 6 years as chief economist at the Department of Work and Pensions was to explain to 6 successive secretaries of state the lump of labour fallacy, that there isn't a fixed number of jobs in the economy, and that therefore increased immigration or more women working adds not just to labour supply, but also to labour demand, and hence doesn't necessarily mean there are fewer jobs for the rest of us. So that's the first thing that I think we can do usefully. The second, I think, is, to put it bluntly, to call bullshit. So recently, Change Britain, which is supposedly a think tank that Michael, I think, helped to set up, claimed that leaving the customs union and if the UK left the customs union and concluded new free trade deals with countries ranging from India to Korea could create 400,000 new jobs because of the projected increase in UK exports. And Michael was quoted in the Telegraph as saying that the report indeed showed how new trade deals will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Leaving aside the realism of those new deals, and that's a much more political economy question, look at the logic here. What did Change Britain do to come up with this number? They took some estimates from the European Commission of the potential boost to both imports and to exports that you would get from trade deals. Then they translated those increased exports into extra British jobs. They then forgot somehow to translate the increased imports into fewer British jobs. Now, I think an intelligent 10-year-old, fortunately we've got one sitting in the front row right over there. She happens to be related to me, but I think an intelligent 10-year-old can understand what the problem is with this logic. But the Today program doesn't invite 10-year-olds, not to discuss economic reports. They don't have the credibility. They invite people like me. And so I think for better or worse, a large part of my job in this field is what my friend Brad DeLong at Berkeley calls intellectual garbage disposal. It's pointing out this stuff. So that's the second function. And then the third and the most difficult, and where the element of judgment comes in, is synthesizing the consensus of experts on a difficult topic where there isn't one right answer. And that can be topics from the minimum wage to grammar schools, and trying to put that in context and explain why it does or doesn't matter. And I think this is where public and the politicians need it most. And I'm going to give a specific example here. Again, I'm going to invite Michael to respond, because I think it's a good illustration of what experts are good for, at the same time as illustrating why the public don't necessarily trust politicians quoting experts and hence don't trust us either. Julia mentioned Michael's interview with Faisal, and she's quite right. That the full quote that Michael said was, people in this country have had enough of experts from organizations with acronyms getting it wrong, saying that they know what is best. But I think the problem here is Michael is actually quite happy to quote those experts from those organizations with acronyms when it suits him. So 3 weeks before the referendum, Michael said, quote, "The Bank of England has said that a 10% rise in the proportion of new people coming here is associated with a 2% pay cut for working people. Now, the Bank of England was precisely one of these organizations with acronyms that always gets it wrong, supposedly. But it's worse than that. Michael was right. The bank had published a study by experts on labor markets and immigration, on immigration and wages. But the interpretation of that study was from the Daily Express, not from the actual experts. He could have asked an expert. He could have read my blog on the subject, which explained the actual impact on the wages of low-paid British workers, which is actually, as calculated in that report, not 2%, but more like 1%. But more importantly, not 1% as a result of a 10% rise in the proportion of new people coming here. 1% is over the entire period of very high immigration since about 2002 to about 2014. About 0.1% per year, in other words. So that's quite a different story. And you don't have to take my word for this. You can ask Steve Nicol, who's one of the UK's foremost economists. As it happens, he's also one of the people who wrote the report. So when the Independent interviewed him, he said that the impact his paper found was, quote, infinitesimally small, unquote. And he complained that during the campaign, because of his official position, he couldn't point out the facts of what his paper actually said. So, I'm not claiming here, it's important to make this point, it's not illegitimate for people like Michael who want to end free movement to claim that it's bad for low-paid workers. I don't think that's what the evidence shows, but there's an argument there, and they can make their case. And I'm not claiming Michael was being deliberately misleading. I'm sure he wasn't. But I think the really important point here is that Michael didn't think it was enough to assert his point without evidence. He wanted to appeal to the authority of experts, to the authority of the very experts of the Bank of England. I think that's an interesting sort of contradiction that we have to deal with. That sometimes politicians want to make use of us, sometimes they don't. How we navigate that. And I think it also implies that Michael and I recognize that Michael's actually rather good, as politicians go on this point, does believe that that empirical evidence matters, and that you should look at the empirical evidence analyzed by experts before making up your mind. I think, far too often neither our politicians nor our media, and that's on all sides of the argument, want to do that. So where does that leave us in the end? I do think, what I have said doesn't mean that, and criticisms of politicians in general, and the media in general, or indeed Michael, doesn't mean that experts, and particularly economists, don't need to do much better. We do need not to present forecasts as fact, and we do need to call out politicians, and I think we're too reluctant to do so, to call out politicians who present our forecasts as fact. And I think some of the things George Osborne, for example, said during the campaign and the referendum were a very good example of that. There was nothing necessarily wrong with the analysis done by economists. There was a lot wrong with the way that the Chancellor chose to make use of it. And we do need to explain what we do know and what we don't. We're not here to make political choices. Experts shouldn't make political choices. But you can't, or at least you shouldn't, I hope, make political choice without listening to experts. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. The right to reply, Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you, Jonathan. And Jonathan's presentation was every bit as lucid as you would expect from the blogs that he has written and the work that he has done. Jonathan's contribution to public debate and to helping to illuminate arguments on a range of issues is great. And I'm grateful to him for taking part in this event this evening. And Jonathan has a number of advantages over me. One of them, of course, is that he is an economist and I am a politician. Talking of acronyms, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, once said, "A politician giving a speech on economics is a bit like urinating down your own leg." Except he didn't use the word urinating. It may seem hot to you, but everyone else just thinks it's embarrassing. So I'm not going to go into a great detail about economics tonight. I am, however, going to spend, please indulge me, a few seconds shooting fish in a barrel. I talked about experts, groups with acronyms, the individuals who spoke on behalf of those groups during the course of that high-pressure, high-intensity interview with Faisal Islam. And both Jonathan and Julia have been gracious enough to acknowledge that I wasn't talking about every expert. I wasn't talking about physicists, doctors, engineers, mechanics. I was talking specifically about economists and those who speak for particular organisations. Organisations like the OECD, the IMF, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and the CBI. And during the course of the referendum, the OECD said Britons will be paying a heavy Brexit tax for many years if the UK leaves the EU. A UK exit from the EU, the OECD said, would immediately hit confidence and raise uncertainty, which would result in GDP being lower. Then, on Wednesday, the 21st of September, Larry Elliott of The Guardian reported, the OECD, the West's leading economic think tank, has backtracked on its warning that the UK would suffer instant damage from a Brexit vote and thrown its weight behind plans by Theresa May. Of course, the OECD wasn't alone. The IMF also got it wrong, and it was reported in The Telegraph by Ambrose Evans-Pritchard on the 29th of July 2016. The International Monetary Fund's top staff misled their own board, made a series of calamitous misjudgments in Greece, became euphoric cheerleaders for the Euro project, ignored warning signs of impending crisis, and collectively failed to grasp an elemental concept of currency theory. And as it went with both of those, so it went with prominent figures who'd been on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, like Professor Danny Blanchflower. Professor Blanchflower famously said before 2010 that George Osborne's economic policies would result in 5 million people being unemployed. That never materialized. And in fact, at every turn, when Professor Blanchflower was predicting either increased unemployment or a slowdown in wage growth, precisely the opposite happened. Professor Blanchflower was also, of course, a critic of leaving the European Union and argued that Theresa May, when she unveiled what he deemed her hard Brexit approach in a speech at Lancaster House, that Theresa would signal to the markets a determination to pursue a Brexit that would lead sterling to fall. Sterling, of course, responded to Professor Blanchflower by rising, the fastest rise in any single day, I think for several years, as a result of, as a result of his tweet, I suspect. It's also the case that the CBI, an organisation which speaks for British industry and which has many great people working for it, has again been consistently wrong. Because it, like all of these other organisations, not only said that Brexit would lead to an economic hit almost immediately, the decision to leave the European Union was taken almost immediately after the referendum result. The CBI, like all these other organisations, and this was my point in the campaign, had said that Britain being outside the single currency would be a bad thing and would lead to economic calamity. And they pointed out, quite rightly, that if you're outside a single currency area, your business has to pay costs, face uncertainties, hedge in order to deal with currency risk. All of those things are true. But it was also the case that being outside the single currency meant that Britain's economy was saved from the tragedy inflicted on those countries that did join the single currency: Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and others. And the same thing, of course, applies now. It is the case that leaving the European Union necessarily involves perhaps some additional friction, perhaps some new questions which some would say pose an uncertain future for our country. But it is also the case that by taking back control, we're able, as we were when we were outside the single currency, to pull levers that could drive our economy forward faster and over any bumps in the road more effectively than if we'd given up and continued to yield control to others. Now, one of the reasons why I mention these organisations and these individuals who've got things wrong is because during the course of the referendum campaign, and Jonathan's right, often in politics, people quote an expert from a world-beating organisation as a way of closing the argument down, playing the ace of trumps. Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of the IMF, says this. So you must be wrong, Michael Gove, with your 2-1 in English. What do you know? But actually, what we found is that sometimes very, very distinguished people, Olivier Blanchard knows far more about economics than I do, get it wrong. Because they are, as the IMF's own body pointed out, often in the grip of a particular example of either groupthink or intellectual vanity or plain error. And Jonathan is right that we should not take the predictions of economists as though they were hard scientific facts which rank with a physicist being able to tell you what the reaction will be to any particular action. The truth is that economics can sometimes be a useful way of understanding human behavior and making political decisions. Of course it can. But it is wrong to try to close down any debate by saying this expert takes a particular view and this expert trumps the wisdom of others, including the wisdom of crowds. Because if we believed that an expert judgment should automatically trump the judgment of all of us, then why have a democracy in the first place? Indeed, there are some academics who've called for what they call an epistocracy. They want those with knowledge to be able to take decisions. Well, I think that would be tragic. I think that would be the mistake that Plato argued for in the past, a mistake that would lead, unfortunately, to error after error, because technocrats, when they have been given the chance to shape policy free from democratic pressure, have made mistake after mistake, the single currency being one of the most momentous. And of course, in drawing a distinction between economists and physicists, I'm not just choosing two separate academic disciplines at random. As Jonathan, who was a mathematician as an undergraduate, absolutely exemplifies, hard sciences, maths, physics, chemistry, all require a standard of proof and all require people to operate in a way, as Popper pointed out, which is different from the way in which some social science disciplines operate. I'm not saying that the social sciences are any less worthy of study, absolutely not. But what I am saying is that the predictability of events in the physical sciences is very different from the predictability of events that social scientists sometimes, too often, are tempted in making predictions about. Two other things before I hand back to Julia. One, I talked about groupthink in passing. Recently, in America, Jonathan Haidt, a distinguished and acknowledged left-of-center academic, has set up an organization called the Heterodox Academy. Why? Because he is worried that on campuses in America and in Britain, the natural tendency of academics to trend towards the left has moved from a situation where you have a majority of academics who are broadly center or center-left to one where in some subjects there is now a monoculture. And Jonathan says that as someone from the left himself. And his particular worry is that dissident views, challenges to orthodoxy, the antithesis to a thesis, which will lead to the fruitful synthesis at the end, that just doesn't exist because people are increasingly reluctant to speak out when there is a monocultural view because they're worried that their academic prospects or indeed their respectability in their eyes of their peers might be harmed. It's not my diagnosis, but his, and it's one that's shared by a growing number of academics in America and Britain. To repeat, they're not objecting to the fact that a majority of people who express a political view might be on the left. They expect it in academia. But what they are concerned about is the growing groupthink that means that in some disciplines, the dissident voice, which is necessary for mankind to advance, is being pushed to the side. And one of the things which I think is hugely welcome is that we do have individuals like Jonathan Haidt or like the Bank of England's chief economist, Andy Haldane, who described the economic consensus about what would happen with Brexit as the profession's Michael Fish moment. These are the voices that we need to value. And we all know that progress in the past, particularly in science, has been driven by radicals, by dissidents, by those outside the consensus. Copernicus was outside the consensus, Galileo was outside the consensus, Einstein was outside the consensus. But they all contributed to the expansion of human knowledge. And that brings me to my final point. The great fruit of the Enlightenment is the recognition that in order to win an argument, of course you can appeal to hearts, but when you appeal to minds, you have to produce evidence. And using the fact that individual A or institution B supports a proposition is not evidence. Looking at the arguments they make, testing those propositions, that is the truly valuable way of deciding whether or not a particular course of action is wise, and being aware, of course, that what was a consensus one day may need to change as events change. When I was at the Department for Education, there was a consensus when I arrived about different things in the education world, and there was a broad consensus in particular around something called differential styles of learning. Some learners were audiovisual, some were kinesthetic, and so on. This view was comprehensively taken apart by Ben Goldacre, a scientist, a medic, a psychiatrist, who we at the Department for Education invited in to look at educational theory as it was being taught to generations of teachers and as it was accepted by some very distinguished head teachers. And the reason why? We believed that it was not enough simply to accept what institutions were telling us. We had to have our own in-house team of skeptics, kicking the tires, questioning the theses, producing genuine evidence. And it's that process, it's the grit in the oyster, the dissident in the academy, that generates progress. And that's why I think when you hear an expert claiming that you should follow his or her path, always, always, always seek out the alternative before accepting the argument. Thank you very much.
Well, let me put some of those points to you, Jonathan. When is it acceptable, do you think, to challenge an expert? Because even, I've got no medical experience, but if I was given a radical diagnosis by a cancer specialist, neuroscientist, it meant radical treatment, I would probably seek a second opinion. There I would be with no medical training, questioning the judgment of someone with great expertise. When are we allowed to question an expert?
Well, I think in that case you'd be quite right, but that's because the state of medicine is such that we know a lot about averages, and you'd be very foolish to question the judgment of a specialist who said, actually, this pill is better in 80% of cases. But there's a lot of variation in individuals, and I think the same specialist would probably tell you, yes, you should get a second opinion. There's enough variation in individuals and how they are judged to mean that actually you will get useful additional information from that, which is why good doctors in difficult cases do usually say you should get a second opinion before you'll make a decision on this. This needs two pairs of eyes. So I think that's a good illustration, actually, of the difference, on the actual hard science there, what's written down.
But then on that basis, so if 10 economists all agree, then they must be right.
Well, I think...
okay, that was a big stretch. 10 economists agreeing. I realised I was on the realms of madness there. But
that's a big stretch. I think, if 10 economists agree about something, the chances are very high that they are right. It's not certain they're right, but it's depending on what the question is, you might well want to seek out and see whether there is anyone, another serious economist who takes a different view. Does that view make sense? Have they got evidence to back it up? We are certainly not unquestionable. But so take. I don't want to make this all about Brexit, obviously, but take the specific narrow question about the impact of being in the EU on trade. Most economists thought that being in the EU boosted our trade with the EU and that it didn't without damaging our trade outside the EU. That's based on very, very complicated econometric models, but actually the basic insight is quite simple, really. You can show it on a graph, actually, if you want to. You can just put on a graph and show, look, this is what happened trading with the EU, this when we joined. You can see that it increased it. You can do the same thing with other historical examples and say, look, we're basically arguing from history there. And then you can make the judgment, I think, that what does economics tell us? It tells us that if history is any guide, we can be pretty certain that joining in the EU was a good thing for our trade. That's what economics can tell you. Anybody who tries to claim that somehow that's an illusion or that people have all got it wrong is probably wrong. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that it's illegitimate for people like Michael to argue, to say, well, yes, but the history is not the future. There are these reasons which economists haven't got in their models, which aren't, by definition, in historical evidence, to think that things might be different in the future. Things might change. We might do these trade deals with other countries. We believe for the following reasons that will boost our, and those are things on which economists have much less certainty. So there's a huge range of trade. We know, there are things where the predictions of economists are almost as good as the hard physicists. We can tell you give me enough data, and if you say, what happens if Tesco doubles the price of red onions tomorrow but leaves the price of white Spanish onions the same, give me the Tesco data for the last year, and we can tell you how consumers will respond, actually, to within a pretty good margin of error. Saying, will the UK make a trade deal with China post-Brexit? And if it does, how much will that boost trade?
There are so many indefinables. And
exactly.
Do you want to answer that?
Yes, no. Well, one of the things is that all economists generally, as Jonathan has, say all other things remain equal. And the truth is that, of course, all other things remain equal. If you double the price of red onions, then fewer people will buy them. But also, if you double the price of red onions, they might become, this is an economic theory, goods of ostentation. It might be the case that people say, if I have a red onion in my salad, everyone will think, I'm pretty ritzy.
It's a very West London sort of
Exactly. And people might think, but this is an expensive thing, which I can show off about. And the truth is, and it is it is the case that there are different ways in which individuals might react. Jonathan was kind enough to engage with a question I asked him when he appeared before us, that committee, related to a book by a man called Akerlof called Identity Economics, which makes the point that people will sometimes change the way in which they behave economically as a result of their identification with a particular group. So it might be the case that I decide to buy a particular product, even though it has less utility for me, because I want to buy British and show I'm patriotic. The truth is that while there can be helpful explanations, and Jonathan is right that the past can often be incredibly illuminating, there is almost always a rival view which one can take, which it is helpful to be aware of before coming to the definitive conclusion. And one thing I'm conscious of is that I didn't take up Jonathan's two challenges on the two points he mentioned earlier about the Change Britain report and also about the Bank of England. Just briefly on the Change Britain report.
Very briefly. I'm sure we've got lots of questions to come.
Of course, if you increase exports, you increase jobs, but also if you increase imports, you can make your economy more competitive as a result, and you can increase productivity. And one of the arguments put by people who wanted us to remain was trade will diminish if we leave the European Union, and that will have an impact on our productivity, and that will have an impact on growth. I actually think trade will increase, but we will see. But again, it can be cut both ways. On the Bank of England point, I had a look at the report, and the point that I was trying to make, and it was a point that I've subsequently discussed with some people at the Bank of England, is it may seem in terms of the overall economy that Stephen Nickel's point is that the change is very small. But for individuals, at a time when so much else is not going right for them, to be aware that they are suffering economically as a result of migration, and when the fruits of economic growth appear to be concentrated in the hands of those who are powerful and who have connections, the sense of injustice can be greater and the demand for change proportionately greater as well. And I think all of us would recognise that, exactly as you pointed out right at the beginning, Jonathan, immigration can increase productivity, but it can have a downward effect on the wages of the least skilled, and that is certainly something that has been experienced in parts of the United Kingdom.
I want to ask this question to you first, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well, Jonathan. I mean, you were pointing out, we should call out politicians who, they're very happy to quote experts when it suits them, and there's no question. I think the debate is often really, it's a political judgment about not whether the facts are right, but which facts we think are the most important, or which ones we value the most. What is the point of experts in government bodies, whether it's the Bank of England or it's outside OECD? What is the point of them if politicians aren't going to listen to them?
Well, I think you should listen to them, but I think the whole point is that you should have an argument rather than a submission. So the best ministers are the ones who deliberately want to have a wide range of opinion around them and then challenge it. Nigel Lawson was famously loved in the Treasury, including by people who didn't agree with or support the broad policy direction he was taking, because his style of government was to get all the voices in one room and then to argue vigorously and to test his case and then to adjust those arguments that were weak or to ditch those policies that he thought were wrong. One of the reasons why he opposed the community charge, poll tax, is because he had those arguments in the Treasury and knew that it would be a bad idea. Now, all politicians get things wrong, but one of the reasons why I think that he will be remembered as, next to Margaret Thatcher, the most consequential political figure of the 1980s, is because he enjoyed argument, as indeed did Mrs. Thatcher. She was sometimes imperious and high-handed, but she deliberately wanted to hear the points of view of others and then argue back.
Just to elucidate on that, we have this situation in our constitution effectively where we don't put experts in charge. We have politicians, no offence. I've got a 2-1 in PP, so it's even worse than your degree. But we don't put politicians, we put politicians in charge, not experts. We have experts in their departments to advise them, but we let them make the final decision. Indeed, voters, we don't require voters to have PhDs before they get to have a say or to sit on a jury. Do you think there's an element where experts should, know their place?
Yes, of course, and I broadly agree with what Michael said about what the right procedure is in departments and how ministers ought to behave. And I do, unfortunately, however, think, and this isn't an ideological point, that ministers have become, partly because of the pressures of politics and the media, have become less like that since Nigel Lawson's time over the last, Michael may have been an exception, I didn't work for him, but I think over the last, I worked in Nigel Lawson's Treasury, and I think Michael's description is accurate. I think we've gone downhill rather since then in the last 35 years. There's much less of that. There's less of that sort of vigorous debate within departments. But I think, the idea that voters need PhDs or that ministers shouldn't make ultimate decisions, I think is as Michael said, is wrong. But we do, and I think rightly so, in some areas we do democratically delegate quite a lot of elements of decision-making to experts. The Bank of England has a huge amount of power, arguably too much power in some respects, some people would say, to set monetary policy, to regulate finance, all sorts of things which certainly verge on political decisions, but are regarded as being sufficiently technical that you need experts to do them. Similarly, of course, we delegate NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, to make decisions notionally on the cost-benefit of different drugs, but in practice, choosing between a breast cancer drug and a bowel cancer drug and IVF is inevitably a politically charged decision. But we somehow think that actually that's probably better than some of the alternatives. So there aren't any easy answers on that, I think.
Okay, final question from me, because I'm sure lots of people want to ask questions. Do put your hand up and get my attention, and I will get a microphone to you. And I'll come back to you on this one just to give you both a chance to answer first. Is there an issue with experts with the idea that's been played out and was very much questioned during the Brexit debate, that experts are neutral, that experts sit above, that experts have no personal bias, they're totally independent, when we all come at everything with our own value judgments? It may not be a party political judgment or a Remain or Leave judgment, but they'll come with their own value judgments about what are the important facts, what are the relevant facts, and what are the desirable outcomes. Do you think that that's a problem? And maybe certainly in the field of the economists and social science generally, that actually the claim of neutrality and independence perhaps has been overplayed?
Absolutely, and I think there is a difference between sort of neutrality or pure freedom from bias and objectivity. I would like, obviously I have my own personal prejudices like everybody else. I like to think, though, that on the things that I'm expert about, I talk about the evidence in an objective a fashion as I can, and that's my job. So, and this was part of my little Twitter spat with Michael when he sort of said, "But Jonathan, you voted Remain," and I said, "Well, I didn't said to anybody how I voted in the campaign, and it's not relevant because I don't, I might have voted Remain because I believe in the great European ideal, or I might have voted Leave because I believe in the sovereignty of the Queen in Parliament, or whatever. But that's not what I'm here as an expert, at least, in the media to talk about."
In no way did your views on that in any way affect your selection of facts in the way that You're saying that it did for...
Yeah, that's right. So when I talk about immigration and the impact of free movement, it's not affected by my wider views on the European Union, good or bad. It may. So on that, I think I am genuinely objective. Equally, though, people might rightly say, look, you've been working on immigration for 15 years. You are an expert. Inevitably, over that period, you've picked up some views, a perspective. It may not be a political bias, it may be not relevant to the EU, but there's clearly a point of view there. So when people say you're a pro-immigration economist and you come at it from that lens, that's a fair point.
Michael, is that what undermined for you the views of the experts, the OECD, the IMF, simply because they were seen by the voters who voted leave as being somehow part of the establishment, coming to it with a Remain bias? That seemed to be the perspective in the papers at the time.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think that obviously people come to conclusions for a whole range of reasons. We are both thinking and emotional beings. With the IMF, as its own sort of review revealed, there was a bias which led the IMF to look at information in a particular way, and they fell prey to what many of us fall prey to, which is confirmation bias. Facts which back up our worldview, we leap on with relish. Facts which may not quite fit, we perhaps skip over lightly or occasionally forget. That means that we can come to conclusions or make arguments in which every step is backed up by a fact, but not all of the facts, simply those that we've selected by our desire, sometimes not even willful, sometimes unconscious, to have our own worldview reinforced. And I don't think that when academics produce research, I don't think that they consciously suppress information or consciously highlight information in order to reinforce a particular point. But I do think that sometimes there can be an unconscious desire to light on some pieces of information that reinforce the strength of a particular thesis, and sometimes less willingness to give equal prominence to other data that might undermine that thesis.
Right, I think we've got a lot of experts in our audience who are probably desperate to ask questions themselves. Would you go for the lady just in the white cardigan there? Thank you. And do keep your hands up so I can direct a microphone to you.
Hello. Dr. Eliza Philby, King's College London, and I can confirm, Michael, that experts absolutely do have a kind of self-interest and bias when writing their works of expertise. But I just wanted to offer a sort of broader perspective, really, on why we are living in an age when experts are so distrust. And it seems to me not an obvious point that we are living in an age also when we have the world's information in our pocket, in an iPhone, in a smartphone. And we are enabled as a populace to reveal hypocrisy, to reveal the self-interest of experts, counterfactuals. And so in a way, we have a greater capacity to distrust experts in a way that we have never before. But also, as we know, social media kind of has created this world of kind of silos where we are looking for facts that reinforce our inherent biases. So in a sense, it strikes me as actually quite logical that populism as a political movement sources much of its energy and force in a kind of anti-intellectualism. And I think the great divide in politics now is not between age, gender, sexuality, or anything else. It's between those that went to university and those that have not. And I think the kind of real tension in society is that kind of anti-intellectualism versus, that kind of populist instinct.
Okay. Would you like to comment on that? Not directly a question, but...
Yes.
Can we keep them a bit short?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of issues there. I think some of that sort of debunking or questioning or fact-checking element of social media I find really, really positive. I enjoy doing it myself. I enjoy seeing it done. So I think that sort of democratization and enabling public debate, enabling what we experts do, both to be communicated to the public much more rapidly, instead of having to wait for it to be published in journals and so on and percolate through, communicated much more rapidly and equally questioned questioned, contrasted with other views, and so on. All of that is positive. On the other hand, you're also right that there is also a silo effect, which feeds very much into exactly what Michael just said, which I agree with entirely, about the risk of confirmation bias. And the more that we all succumb to that, the worse it's going to be, both for experts and politics in general.
I mean, certainly worse than the media in America.
Yes, I mean, I think that I broadly agree with that intervention, and I think, funnily enough, in a seminar room in Westminster tonight, they're discussing a new book by David Goodhart, who is a friend of Jonathan's and someone I admire as well. David Goodhart's book posits the fact that there are essentially, very similar to your own thesis, two groups of people, not just in Britain, but in the developed world, the anywhere people and the somewhere people. The anywhere people, broadly graduates whose skills allow them to work anywhere. Somewhere people, those people, generally not graduates, who are tied to a particular place because of the nature of their education, employment, affections. And between these two nations, there is, as you quite rightly point out, a growing sense of, what's the word? Well, difficulty.
You mentioned that book, but it's an ideal opportunity for mention that Jonathan has a new book out, available in all good bookshops and bad ones as well. Capitalism, 50 Things You Need to Know.
Thank you.
There's a lady with the microphone just there.
Hi. I'd really like to hear from the politician and the economist. What do you think are the benefits and the challenges of the other experts in the public debate and the Brexit campaign, such as the data analysts, the advertisers, the campaigning experts? I think both, I'd like to hear both your views on that.
Michael first?
I'm interested in this area, interested that both Barack Obama and Emmanuel Macron have benefited from sophisticated big data analysis. It's also the case that both Vote Leave and Stronger In had done work in order to try to identify the people who might be open to their arguments and tried to ensure that those arguments were shaped in order to move people. It is an emerging area, and I think that, as some recent reporting has pointed out, we need to be aware of and vigilant towards the way in which the debate can be shaped, because we've grown up at a time where almost all political communication will have been open. Whether those are politician speeches, party election broadcasts, newspaper articles, television broadcasts. Now, through a variety of means, messages can be tailored and passed on to individual voters under the radar. And in so doing, that poses a challenge to our democracy to think, how do we ensure that that system is not corrupted? Now, I'm not a Luddite by nature. And I therefore think that whenever you have a technological breakthrough, it's always the case that fogies will say, it's a disaster, this printing press thing, because it will lead to the questioning of the spiritual authority of His Holiness, and our society will break down. Actually, it's a liberation. So I'm not saying that being able to reach more people, being able to give more people a voice, being able to connect people with new ideas and thoughts is in itself a bad thing. But we do need to be aware that the world of political communication, like the world of all communication, is changing. And in order to keep our democracy healthy, we need to think about what the best way of responding might be.
Jonathan?
I broadly agree with that. What have I learned from other disciplines? I mean, I think, on the sort of data analysis and campaign stuff, I think the writings, I won't call them a blog, because a blog is normally the sort of thing that I write, the sort of long essays that your former advisor, Dominic Cummings, who was the brains of the Leave campaign on this, are really absolutely fascinating reading, and I recommend them to anyone who wants to know what's going on. Similarly, I'd also recommend this on slightly more conventional political science, the work done by Eric Kaufman at Birkbeck on the way in which identity rather than economics fed into how people voted. I think is fascinating and underpins some of what's in David Goodhart's book, as well as some of the sort of stuff that Jonathan Haidt, as Michael said, has been saying.
Gentleman just over here.
Thank you. I just want to push the discussion a little, because obviously everybody's being very, very polite. And I don't want to embarrass Michael Gove by bringing up what he said about Nazis. But the point, of course, forget the thing about Nazis, but your point in that case was that the experts are not just wrong and they don't just disagree with each other, they don't just have confirmation bias, but they're corrupt. That was your point, and you wanted to bring this up in the public debate, in a referendum. You wanted to say the experts are corrupt and the people know better. And Nigel Lawson also backed up your point, saying the experts prostituted themselves. So I just want to push it a little, because you're being too polite for me. The charge that you made in public was that the experts were lying for their own benefit.
Well, I remember exactly what I said, not least because I apologised for it the next day. I was making a point about in essence, my point was simply because a majority take a particular view, that doesn't automatically mean that it's right. And I used the wrong comparison. I used the comparison of Einstein when the German regime between 1933 and 1945, I won't give it a particular ideology, you know what I mean. When they got a group of people to denounce Einstein, Einstein said, look, if I was wrong, one would have been enough. And that was a fair point, but I could have made the point far more elegantly by making reference to either John Stuart Mill or Galileo or any one of a number of other people. It was no part of my intention to suggest that people were corrupt, quite the opposite. My argument was to say that simply because a majority hold a particular view, that doesn't mean that they're right. Examine the arguments rather than simply the weight of numbers. But of course, one of the things that I realise that all politicians should realise is that invoking in any argument the government in Germany between 1933 and 45 is a bad idea. And Godwin's law, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, which is sooner or later any discussion on the internet will invoke that regime, is a very good law for a very good reason. And I think that there are so many wonderful examples that one can draw from history in order to illustrate any argument that you don't need to go there, and it generally devalues the debate. And that was one of the things. There are many things in the campaign I will not apologise for, which people sometimes ask me to, but I did apologise for that, and you give me an opportunity, I hope, to better explain what I was thinking and why I also think that I expressed myself in a lamentable fashion.
Can I just say what a very different answer it would have been if Ken Livingstone was here? But anyway,
because I think that's the, I think what Michael just said is entirely reasonable and perfectly fair response. But I don't think it quite answers the question that I think the gentleman was intending to ask, which was not so much about the Nazi stuff, which, as you say, was just a mistake, but about the accusation that people were giving views because they were being paid to do so. So you did say in the Faisal Islam interview, organizations that have consistently made errors, and you're referring to people like the CBI, whatever, organizations that have received money in many cases from the European Union. And now maybe that was an interview, and you've said also that was just a high-pressure interview. But the Vote Leave campaign did also put out a statement saying quite specifically that the Institute for Fiscal Studies was a paid-up propaganda wing of the European Union. And that was
I got that press release.
Yes. Now, and I do think it would be good, actually, if you would say that was really, that was not a slip. That was just a disgraceful thing to say, and unforgivable in my view.
Well, there are two things. One, I'll go back and look at the specific. I didn't see the press release about the IFS, but I will look back at that. Yeah. But the point about the CBI, since it was me who said it, I'll absolutely defend it. I think one of the things is that the CBI has had a view which is not necessarily reflected the view of the majority of British industry. And when Carolyn Fairbairn was kind enough to come in front of our select committee, I did ask her explicitly, not just about the CBI's opinions, but also about how effectively it canvassed them, who its membership were, where its money came from. She had the right, and she reserved the right, not to answer all of my questions. That's fair enough. But I do think that when you've got an organisation which is a lobbying organisation, like the CBI, the question as to where its resources come from and how it forms its opinion is a fair one. With the IFS, I absolutely agree that's a very fair challenge, and I will write back to you and make sure that
we're not starting all over again, are we?
No, and make sure it's I'll and share with Anand and the team here exactly what the correct answer is, because I don't recall that particular point.
I've had a Twitter spat with you, so I'm pretty sure you're going to hold him to that. This lady over here, and then we'll do Andrew, and then someone whose father's got mentioned a lot today.
All right, well, I'm an economist at an institution with the acronym NICER, and I was pleased to hear you mention Ben Goldacre, because Ben Goldacre has made the point that quite a lot of research, clinical trials that have unfavorable results are suppressed, and that this is a real problem. Equally, when you just discussed economists' short-term assessment of the impact of Brexit, you didn't mention that our assessment was that there would be little to no impact immediately on GDP. So what can we do to ensure that politicians, experts, journalists give a more balanced view rather than doing what Ben Goldacre decries, which is suppressing any evidence that is inconvenient for their argument?
Well, I think Ben is a fantastic writer, and his work has been, as I mentioned, a great help to government, both at the Department for Education and at the Ministry of Justice. I deliberately invoked organisations that had said that there would be an immediate hit. So the OECD said there would be an immediate hit. The IMF to do the Treasury as it happens. The broader arguments as to what will happen in the long term, I would also take issue with, but you are right that there are some organisations that took a more nuanced view or who entered criticisms or objections to the case made for leaving the European Union, which were rooted in different analyses. And I think the right thing to do is to have that conversation. The other thing that I would say is that if we look at the media in the United Kingdom, the mainstream media, often derided, actually, I think it does a pretty good job in making sure that a range of views are represented. So I'm going to praise a newspaper which you might not expect me to, The Guardian. Larry Elliott, its economics editor, has a worldview, but he, I think, is very fair in the way in which he reports things. If you read The Guardian, you will find within it those people who will want to highlight certain accounts or stories of what is happening as a result of our vote to leave, which would lead you to believe that it was a mistake. But you will also find people like Larry and like John Harris who take a different view. And I think that it's great that in a newspaper like The Guardian, which also has a clear editorial line, that you will find diversity of opinion. And I think that is true of most of the quality press in this country. And if you don't like the quality press and you prefer something a little more raucous and populist, then there are a choice of raucous and populist newspapers within which you will also find a range of views, all of which are there as part of a healthy debate.
May I bring Jonathan in briefly? We've just got a few more minutes left. I want to get 2 or 3 more questions in if we could keep it.
Well, I should obviously declare an interest here. At the time Monique was talking about, I too was working at NICER, an organisation with an acronym, and we did take, I think, a slightly more, collectively it was much more Monique's business than mine, a more nuanced view. But just in slight defence of the other organisations that are, or at least of the economists working for the other organisations with acronyms, I think Michael's running together 2 criticisms which are need to be separated, both of which are arguably legitimate but are separate. One is the group thing among economists at the IMF or economists at the Treasury before the crisis about particular technical aspects of economics. That's one set of issues. And there's another set of issues about the politicians, and they are politicians, let's face it, like Monsieur Gurria, who runs the OECD, and Madame Lagarde, who runs the IMF, who took what economists had been saying, which was much more measured and analytical, and turned it into political sound bites for explicitly political reasons. And we know that. It's unfair, I think, to blame the staff economists at those organisations for that.
That is a very fair point. And one of my concerns during the debate and subsequently is that when Christine Lagarde spoke, it was regarded as an ex-cathedral pronouncement from an economic genius, yes, when in fact she is a very skillful but still politician with an agenda.
Yes. I'm amazed there's any note of agreement. Another question.
Andrew Jimson from Conservative Home. Could I just correct a very serious error that Michael Gove has committed in print and also this evening? He blamed German technocrats for the launch of the euro. I was living in Germany at the time, and the technocrats warned over and over again that you could not have, that this currency could not work from an economic point of view. The German public also thought it was madness to have a common currency between Germany and Italy. They knew. Any German you met in a bar would tell you that. So the technocrats, neither the technocrats nor the people were to blame. The people to blame were the cowardly political establishment dragooned by Helmut Kohl.
Anything, briefly? Can I get the microphone to Dr. Thank you. Sorry. If you want to answer briefly on that, gentlemen.
Some of my best friends are Germans.
and he meets them in bars.
Yes, it's really a question for Jonathan, I think, but Philip Tetlock has written a lot about forecasting, and he points out that economists have forecast about, I think it's about 23 of the last 7 recessions. And Michael illustrated certain economists' failings. And I find it interesting that, as far as I know, maybe you know, none of them have actually lost their job. Now, newspaper editors, when they publish too many incorrect stories that attract big libel actions, get fired. And I speak from experience. The politicians who cop things up get fired. Fund managers who cop things up get fired. Doctors who perform too many bad operations get struck off. But somehow, I don't think the leading experts in your field seem to suffer this fate. And I wonder what the reason is. Can I suggest a possible reason? Is that actually what you do is not taken seriously?
Okay, so that's a fair set of questions. I mean, I think the first point to make is that the leading experts in my field don't do economic forecasting. Let's be quite clear about that. Economic forecasting is a niche activity done by a rather small number of economists at the Treasury, the Bank of England, and the OBR, and indeed NISA. Very small, and if you listen to the person who does the most forecasting and does it most publicly in this country, Robert Choate, he's the guy who stands up and presents what are essentially the official forecasts of the Office of Budget Responsibility, on which the government makes all it basis of all the government. He stands up every time and says, here are some forecasts. They will be wrong. They will be wrong for some of the reasons that Michael said about the unpredictability of human behavior, and for partly because some things are, by definition, a sun shock is not forecastable. So I think to say that most of the people who actually do this will tell you the point of their forecast is not to be right. The point of the forecast is to provide a baseline on which to make policy, for better or worse. So that's one answer. And I've drew the distinction when, after Andy Haldane made his speech about the Michael Fish moment, I wrote a column saying, a short blog saying, that's right, but the fact that economic forecasting, like weather forecasting in the short term, is often unreliable, doesn't mean that you shouldn't take climate scientists seriously when they tell you what the impact of a certain amount of carbon dioxide emissions will be on global climate in the next 30 years. And equally, you shouldn't not take economists seriously when they tell you what will be the impact of different sets of trade agreements on trading volumes over the next 30 years. That is a rather different set of analyses.
Michael, very briefly, and can I ask you, gentlemen, can we squeeze in 2 more very quick questions, if you can take the time? Lovely. So if you want to come back on...
No, nothing to add.
Gentlemen at the back, and I'll squeeze a couple more questions in as well.
It's a question for Michael. How would you like to see experts... it's a question for Michael. How would you like to see experts like the Bank of England deployed in the next Scottish independence referendum?
Mercifully, it's not a matter for me, for all sorts of reasons. Funnily enough, since the referendum, I got to know Andy Haldane at the Bank of England, and I think he's a brilliant man, and fascinating to listen to. I mean, my broader point would be that during the course of the, if an independence referendum a second one does take place, I hope that people will ensure that a wide range of views are heard and that they're all interrogated with vigour and rigour.
Would you like to come back?
I think, you know, it is the bank is in a very difficult position in something like a Scottish referendum, and I think it has to be extremely careful, actually, both because of the experience of the Brexit referendum and because of its constitutional position. And I would say, while it has to do contingency planning, as it did for the referendum, and has to do some analysis, it should probably avoid getting drawn in too much to saying this is what would happen to an independent Scotland. You know, there are plenty of people outside who can do that stuff.
And remember to mention if you've got a brother working at a bank. This lady over here.
Hi, this is for you, Michael. If economists are consistently mistaken, as you said, and often wildly overestimate the negative effects of various policies, then is it your view that that this or that policy doesn't really have that much of an effect on the economy, and that it just behaves in a random way, and therefore any expert prediction is just redundant nonsense?
No, I don't think that. I think that the important thing to do is to, at the risk of repeating myself, look for the alternative view in any debate and test propositions against each other. And one of the things that I think is revealing about economics is that you can have, you know, there's a broad consensus, as Jonathan's pointed out, in the profession among certain issues, but you will always find dissidents. So Bob Rowthorne, who very, very distinguished economist, not well at the moment, but Bob Rowthorne would take a very different view from Jonathan about migration, and he's a distinguished economist. Now, he's in a minority within the profession, I think it would be fair to say, but I think the really important thing to do is that it's important if I were charged with developing migration policy in this country, and I think most people would be reassured to know that I'm not ever likely to be, but if I were...
Rather you than Theresa May, well, thank you very much.
I think she's the right person for that job. But if I were, then I would have Jonathan in, I would listen to him, I'd ask him some questions, I would have someone who took Bob Rowthorne's position in, and indeed I might well ask them to come along to a seminar with some of my team in order to test some of those propositions before coming to a conclusion. And the fact that Jonathan's view was shared by 90% plus of his profession, that would be a factor to weigh, you know. But I'd want to hear the alternative view before coming to a conclusion.
I think that's a perfectly reasonable position for a politician to take, yes. I mean, I think
I feel
actually...
a butt coming on.
Well, I mean, I thought actually when Bob and I... so these committee appearances, I actually wasn't your committee, you weren't there, but Bob and I appeared before the Lord's Economics Affairs Committee a few weeks ago, and actually we seemed to agree on 90% of the propositions about immigration, actually. So, I mean, you know, and that going back to the previous question, you know, economists, you know, 90% of economists doing in government or doing policy analysis work on microeconomic issues, not on forecasting. We do technical stuff. What's the best way to design an immigration policy? What sort of welfare to work programs work and what don't? What will be the impact of changing this regulatory structure for the rail industry? That's the sort of stuff we actually do.
So it's more what we should do rather than what will happen.
Yes.
Okay, I'm afraid we've got time for one more question. The lady's been waiting very patiently there. Don't feel any pressure, but make it a good one.
No pressure. My name is Sigrun Davidsdóttir. I'm an Icelandic journalist. My question is for Michael Gove. You have been describing sort of a way of working for politicians. It's good to talk to experts and to form your arguments, if I understand you correctly. But that's not really what you are famous for. That's not why we are here. We are here because you said that we shouldn't listen to experts. So which one is it? And is this what you have been saying here? Is that what you use in a forum like this? Whereas, you know, on TV, you talk about not listening to experts because that's sort of what sounds very populistic. So which one is it?
Well,
well played.
You've made my point for me, because actually, you have followed what a number of people have said about what I said, which was factually wrong. At the beginning of this evening, it was pointed out, both by Julia and by Jonathan, that I didn't demean all experts. I was very specific in the course of an interview in saying that people have had enough of experts from organisations with acronyms that have got things consistently wrong in the past. It was a very specific charge. Now, because of the way in which I was interrupted by the interviewer, and I make no complaint, that's what interviewers are there to do, that's part of the cut and thrust in journalism, it was assumed that I said that people in this country had had enough of experts. Because there were a number of people on the, particularly but not exclusively on the Remain side of the argument, who regarded the vote to leave the European Union as an irrational and atavistic vote. Therefore, it was assumed that only numbskulls or populists could possibly have done this, and therefore anyone who was leading this charge must have been leading a revolt of know-nothing numbskull populists. Not at all. But what you've exhibited is an example of confirmation bias. You've admitted the inconvenient fact, which is what I actually said, and you've taken half a fact, the first bit of what I've said, and then you've used that to attribute to me a pattern of behaviour, which is not the case. Now, the great thing is, no, but not from me. Not from me. I think one of the things, again, please do go back and look at what I said during the referendum campaign, or indeed what I've said throughout my political career, and what I've always sought to do. I've taken positions which I'm sure you would disagree with, and I'm sure many people in this room would disagree with. But what I've always sought to do is to advance them through debate, to produce what I believe is relevant evidence to put forward that case. And of course there's evidence on the other side. I've always acknowledged that. But if you want to have a civilized debate, which I very strongly believe in, then you need to, not you personally, one needs to, actually, if one's going to criticize an individual, look at what it is that they actually said. Jonathan, quite rightly, said to me over Twitter, Michael, you're criticizing the IMF, and indeed they may have got things wrong, but read this particular report and tell me if you think it's wrong. And that was a fair challenge, and I won't go into now why I do think that part of it is wrong. But his argument was, engage with the detail rather than simply a caricature. And my views were caricatured. That's life. That happens to politicians. If you don't expect your views to, if you're unhappy with your views being caricatured, don't be a politician. But in an occasion like this, I can explain exactly what I meant. And I think the final point that I would make is one of the things that upsets me sometimes is nothing to do with personal criticism of me, but criticism of so many of the people who voted to leave, and the depiction of so many of them as people who were motivated, as I say, by unthinking atavism. I think that the people who voted to leave did so after listening to a debate which engaged passions, certainly, but which also drove turnout to a level that had never been seen before in a democratic choice like this. And I think even if people disagree and think that it was an error and a catastrophe, the thing that we owe to the 17.4 million people who voted to leave is a recognition that there are good and strong arguments that moved them and which they believe, which deserve respect, as that decision deserves respect, because what they were doing is voting for democracy. And democracy is about recognizing that each individual vote is of equal value, whether you've got a PhD or whether you left school at 15, because every citizen is of equal worth in a civilized society.
Before the rousing music starts, I'll give Jonathan a right of reply, and then I'm afraid that will complete our evening.
Well, I don't think I don't think I have anything to reply to that. I think, you know, as Michael has made a sort of political summing up, I need to try and make a sort of summing up on behalf of experts and looking not backwards to the referendum, but forward to the political debates we're going to have in the years to come. You know, what can we, those of us broadly from the expert or intellectual community, how can we try and better inform that democratic debate that Michael has spoken of? And you know, I think that we, as I said at the beginning, we have not done as well as we could do in recognizing our own limitations, the limitations of our knowledge, in trying to engage with debate on issues where there is dissent, and trying, perhaps some of us perhaps have oversimplified the message or presented certainty where it isn't there. And I think there's a real challenge for us to find a way of getting our message across, communicating what we do know, in a way which you, the media, and you politicians can engage with constructively.
I think, yes, lessons learned, certainly for us journalists as well. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. I want to say a huge thank you to the UK and Changing Europe for organising tonight's event. And I'm sure you'll join me in a huge round of applause to thank our two panellists, Jonathan Putters and Michael Gove. And thank you, of course, to you for coming and your fabulous questions. Good night. Well done, chaps. Well done. You guys were fabulous.